The $100 bill was still crisp in my palm when my own son looked me in the eye and told me to get out of his wedding because I didn't fit the guest list. My name is Margaret Vance. I am 68 years old. For the past 41 years, my life has been measured by the steady, rhythmically clicking hum of a sewing machine in a cramped, damp basement shop in Canton, Ohio. The Greyhound bus engine rattled against the freezing asphalt as it rolled past the midnight sign reading Chicago, 120 miles. In seat 12, right beside the fogged-up window, I adjusted the linen-wrap bundle resting flat across my lap. Inside was a hand-embroidered silk shawl and a small velvet box holding my late husband's silver tailoring thimbles. Family heirlooms meant for Chloe, the woman my only son was marrying tomorrow. Before stepping up to the grand entrance of the Lakeshore Hotel, I paused for a moment on the pavement outside. I unwrapped the linen bundle slightly, checking the corners against the cold morning wind. Finding a single fold slightly out of place, I carefully smoothed it down with my thumb. It wasn't about seeking perfection. It was just a mother's quiet, enduring care for a handmade wedding gift meant for her new daughter-in-law. For over 4 decades, my hands have known the scratch of coarse wool, the drag of heavy silk, and the sharp bite of steel needles. Ever since the construction accident took David from me when Julian was just 4 years old, every dollar I earned went into keeping a roof over our heads and sending my boy to college. I hemmed bridesmaid gowns, repaired vintage veils, and lengthened tuxedo trousers for strangers, saving every single cent so Julian could buy his own tools and build a life in this sprawling city. I never bought myself a winter coat that didn't come from a thrift rack, believing every stitch I sewed was building a secure foundation for my boy. The bus had pulled into the downtown terminal just as the morning gray was bleeding over Lake Michigan. My joints ached from the grueling 7-hour ride, but I smoothed out the wrinkles of my only good dark velvet dress, checked the tuck of my silver hair in a glass door, and walked up the stone steps of the Lakeshore Hotel. The air smelled of wet asphalt and expensive eucalyptus. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the grand ballroom, I could see crystal chandeliers throwing diamond lights across rows of white-clothed tables and ice sculptures. I stepped through the revolving doors into a lobby that hummed with quiet wealth. Men in sharp suits and women in silk moved past me with brisk strides. Near the front desk, a digital display board flashed a bright banner, "Welcome Julian and Chloe." For a brief second, a warm smile touched my lips, and I thought about snapping a quick photo of the screen to text our kind neighbor back in Ohio. But I lowered my phone back into my pocket, wanting to see my son in person first. I walked up to a mahogany podium where a young woman in a gray blazer was tapping on a tablet. Clipped to her lapel was a silver badge reading Wedding Coordinator. "Good morning," I said, offering a small, tired smile. "I'm Margaret Vance, Julian Vance's mother." The coordinator stopped typing. Her fingers hovered over the glass screen for a second. She swiped through a long digital document, tapped the screen twice more with a slight frown, and looked up, her expression polite, but completely blank. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice dropping into smooth customer service cadence. "Let me double-check. Margaret Vance. No, I'm looking at the master seating chart right here. Your name is not listed for any of the guest tables, nor is there a placeholder for family." I let out a soft, dry laugh, figuring it was simply a clerical error. "Oh, there must be some small mix-up," I said, adjusting the linen package in my arms. "Julian probably forgot to update the final head count. Could you just give him a quick ring?" Before she could answer, I dialed my son's number directly on my flip phone. Inside the grand ballroom, a string quartet was tuning their violins. Then, out from a side hallway near the private bridal suites, a tall figure emerged. It was Julian. He was wearing a midnight blue designer tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders to perfection, looking every inch the successful downtown contractor he claimed to be. He pulled his phone from his pocket, glanced at the screen, and answered. But instead of walking toward the podium, he froze beside a marble pillar. His face turned pale and terrified, his eyes darting sharply across the lobby in a frantic panic. Mother? His voice came out harsh, breathless and choked. What are you doing here? Why didn't you call me? The hotel locked down the guest list a month ago. There is no seat for you here. I'll call you later and explain everything. The phone went dead with a sharp, echoing click. For nearly 20 agonizing seconds, the ambient noise of the lobby seemed to vanish completely. I stood there holding my flip phone, watching Julian through the heavy glass pane. I still think maybe he's busy or in the middle of preparing. Julian didn't move an inch. The coordinator stood waiting beside me, her pen still poised over the digital desk. Neither of us said a word in that heavy, stretched-out silence. Then slowly, Julian turned and hurried back down the dark hallway toward the private rooms. A valet parking attendant touched my polite elbowly. "Ma'am, you can't block the entryway here. You'll need to step outside." As I turned to move, Julian reappeared from the hallway, walking fast. He didn't look me in the eye. He crossed the marble floor, stopped just short of me, and without a single word, reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out a crisp, folded $100 bill, and shoved it roughly into my palm, curling my fingers over it. His hand was trembling violently, but his voice was ice cold. "Take a cab to the station," he argued, his eyes darting frantically toward the elevator bank. Please, just go." Before I could breathe, he gave my shoulder a gentle, firm shove backward toward the revolving glass door, turned his back entirely, and strode briskly into the heart of the ballroom, disappearing into a sea of silk and laughter. The $100 bill was still crisp in my palm when my own lipstick looked at me in the eye and told me to get out of his wedding because I didn't fit the guest list. I didn't cry. My eyes stayed dry, burning slightly under the harsh indoor lights. I slowly opened my palm, looked down at the crisp green Franklin face, and then shifted my gaze to the marble windowsill right beside the brass revolving doors. For a split second, my instincts told me to leave the linen bundle right there on the reception desk for him to deal with. But then I remembered Julian's fierce warning not to come close or make a scene. I quietly pulled the package closer, holding the gift tight against my chest. I didn't open it. I didn't leave it behind for strangers to gawk at. Quietly, methodically, I laid the folded $100 bill flat against the cold stone ledge. I readjusted the linen wrapping around the silver thimbles and the silk shawl in my arms, turned my back on the glittering lights of the hotel, and stepped out into the biting Chicago morning mist. The return bus ride smelled of stale coffee, damp wool, and diesel exhaust. Outside the smeared glass window, the dark Ohio highway stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the occasional amber flash of highway signs and the blinding headlights of oncoming semi-trucks. I placed the linen-wrapped wedding package flat on the empty seat beside me. Nobody looked at me, and I looked at no one. Sitting there in the dim, vibrating cabin, my mind drifted back to 5 years ago, right when Julian decided to launch his own independent contracting business in Chicago. I remembered the frantic, weeping phone calls late at night, the housing market hitting a sudden slump, supply costs doubling overnight, and Julian on the other end of the line, his voice shaking as he confessed he was on the verge of bankruptcy, before he even turned 30. As a mother, hearing your only child drown in panic makes you feel like you are drowning right beside him. That was when I made the mistake born out of pure, misguided love. I thought shielding him from failure was the same as helping him succeed, letting him lean completely onto my aging shoulders instead of forcing him to face his own reality. I didn't hand him bundles of cash or bypass the law with shady wire transfers. Instead, I worked quietly through legal, automated channels. For 54 consecutive months, using my modest lifelong savings from the basement repair shop, I set up an automated transfer directly into Julian's regional home mortgage account. Every single month, exactly $3,800 left my account to pay off his suburban home loan, keeping his credit pristine and his mortgage fully covered without him ever having to look at the ledger or worry about the balance. To keep those transfers running month after month, I had to quietly cut corners in my own life. When my left knee began throbbing with arthritis 3 winters ago, I skipped the orthopedic doctor and settled for cheap drugstore heating pads. When my eyesight blurred, I kept using my old pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses from the flea market. I kept my heavy winter coat patched at the elbows and continued sewing on my trusty grease-stained Singer mechanical machine, eating simple oatmeal day after day. I convinced myself that my physical discomfort was a fair price to pay for my son's stability, never realizing that every monthly payment was just padding the floor beneath a man who refused to learn how to walk on his own 2 feet. By the time the Greyhound finally wheezed to a halt at the empty Canton depot, the digital clock on the dashboard read 3:15 a.m. The night air was freezing, biting sharply at my chest as I walked the 3 blocks home to my small wooden cottage. The house was pitch black and silent, save for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I walked straight to the kitchen table, sat down on the hard wooden chair, and flipped open my battered silver gray laptop, an old machine Julian had discarded years ago when he upgraded to a sleek new computer. I waited a full minute for the humming machine to connect to the home Wi-Fi network, then typed in my password and navigated straight to my credit union's online portal. I logged into my checking profile and clicked on the Automated Payments tab. The screen loaded slowly, the white background glaring against my tired eyes. There it was, sitting right at the top of the active schedule list. Recurring transfer to Julian Vance, $3,800. Active. There had been several quiet months over the past few years where I stared at my dwindling bank statements in the dead of night, knowing full well my account balance was dangerously close to dropping below the safety margin. Yet, driven by blind habit and maternal instinct, I had still clicked confirm. No explanations to anyone, just pure silent action. Before making my final move to cancel, my tired hand hovered over the plastic computer mouse. I didn't rush. I paused, moved the cursor to open the detailed payment history log, and stared silently at the digital line showing 54 payments completed. I closed the history tab, took a long, grounding breath, and finally prepared to act. I guided the small black arrow on the screen directly over the red button that read Cancel Transfer, and clicked it once. A sharp warning pop-up box instantly appeared over the white screen, blocking out the rest of the page with dark gray shading. The bold black text stared right back at me. Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring transaction? I didn't hesitate. I moved the cursor over to the confirmation box and clicked yes. The screen flickered once, refreshed, and the line item vanished completely from the active list. Just like that, the invisible financial lifeline was severed for good. Just then, my old flip phone buzzed loudly against the wooden table surface with a promotional text alert from the bank. I looked down at the glowing screen for a second, then silently reached out and placed the phone face down, refusing to open it as I let the room fade back into deep, peaceful silence. I reached up and closed the laptop lid. The blue indicator light faded away into total darkness. In that quiet kitchen, sitting alone in the dark, my chest felt hollow and completely weightless. The crushing burden I have carried across half a decade had finally been lifted from my shoulders. Exactly 30 days after the wedding in Chicago, my phone buzzed against the wooden counter of the basement shop while I was cutting a pattern for a silk lining. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked it up. A text message from Julian lit up the screen. "Mom, the bank's automated system flagged a mortgage error. This month's payment didn't go through. Wire the funds over right away. The grace period ends this afternoon." There was no greeting. No question asking if I had survived the 7-hour bus ride home in one piece. No acknowledgement of the wedding that had happened a month ago. Just an order for money, typed out like I was an automated machine attached to a wall. I tapped out my reply with steady fingers, hitting send without hesitation. "Starting this month, you handle your own bills." 3 days later, the gravel driveway outside my small wooden cottage crunched under heavy tires. A late-model luxury SUV slammed to a halt right by my front porch. Julian was behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Twice, his thumb hovered over the call button to dial my number, and twice he pulled it back. When he finally got out, the sharp, expensive designer tuxedo from the wedding was gone, replaced by a rumpled dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows and a tie hanging loosely around his collar. His hair was messy, and his face was slick with sweat, completely stripped of the calm, polished look he wore in the city. He pushed the front door open without knocking and strode straight into my kitchen, his voice pitched high and shaking with panic. "Are you out of your mind, Mom?" Julian shouted, slamming his hand down on the edge of the wooden table. "The bank sent me a default notice. They're threatening to start foreclosure proceedings on the house. How could you just cut off the mortgage payments out of nowhere right when I'm dealing with a cash crunch?" I didn't flinch. I set my ceramic teacup down on its saucer, the small click sounding loud in the quiet kitchen, and looked straight into his frantic eyes. "I'm letting you become a grown man," I said, my voice low and level. Before Julian could open his mouth to fire back, the sound of another car engine echoed outside. A sleek silver sedan pulled up right behind his SUV. The passenger door clicked open and footsteps crunched on the gravel path. A moment later, the front door swung open wide. It was Chloe. She wasn't wearing white satin or diamond earrings. She wore a simple trench coat, her face pale and set hard like stone. In her right hand, she clutched a thick stack of printed bank statements and a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper bearing the official letterhead of the Lakeshore Hotel in Chicago. Julian froze. All the color drained straight out of his face, leaving his skin a sickly ash-gray tone. Chloe walked right past him without a word. She stopped at the kitchen table, took a deep breath, and began to lay out the evidence. Instead of shouting, her voice was dangerously quiet and controlled as she recounted everything she had uncovered over the past week. She calmly explained how she had traced every single mortgage payment back to my account, reviewed our joint ledger discrepancies, and uncovered the secret email Julian had sent before the wedding, ordering my name removed from the honorary family table. She detailed how she had called the hotel manager in Chicago directly to demand an explanation about why her husband's mother was turned away at the door like an unwelcome stranger, how the wedding coordinator had sent her a formal letter of apology that very morning for the seating mix-up, along with the attached digital email evidence, and how she had uncovered the $45,000 in hidden luxury credit card debt accumulated solely to maintain an elaborate illusion of wealth for her family. She tossed the printed copy of Julian's email right onto the center of the table, showing the exact words he had written 2 weeks before the ceremony demanding my removal from the front row to make room for her father. Julian opened his mouth, completely cornered, but not a single sound came out, His lips twitched nervously, his eyes darting back and forth between his wife and me, trapped in the absolute wreckage of his own deception. Chloe didn't bother listening to any excuses. She reached up to her left hand, slipped the diamond wedding band off her finger with a sharp, decisive pull, and dropped it right onto the stack of bank statements. "We're done," Chloe said, her voice cutting through the kitchen like a razor. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out. The front door clicked shut behind her, and the heavy drone of her car engine faded down the gravel driveway, leaving Julian standing alone in the quiet kitchen. Julian walked out of my cottage in a heavy daze, stepping back into his luxury SUV. He sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, staring blankly at the dashboard as the engine idled in the quiet afternoon. Twice his trembling thumb hovered over his phone contacts to call Chloe, desperate to plead his case and salvage whatever was left of his life. Both times, he stopped himself, pulled his hand back, and let the screen go dark without making the call. He shifted gears, started the engine, and drove the long stretch back to the city, parking outside their suburban house. He turned off the motor and sat in the dark car for 20 full minutes, staring through the windshield at the front porch, entirely paralyzed by dread, not daring to step inside. Finally, he forced himself out of the driver's seat, walked up the steps, unlocked the front door, and stepped into the dim hallway. Inside the quiet house, Chloe wasn't waiting to scream, cry, or argue. She had already packed her personal belongings into several suitcases lined up neatly by the door. She stood quietly by the kitchen island, methodically gathering the remaining paperwork, taking documents and placing them into neat individual stacks one by one with chilling precision. Then she opened her laptop, logged into her email account, clicked on the sent folder, turned the screen around, and slid it across the marble counter toward him without saying a single word. Julian looked down at the glowing screen, completely broken. Every single excuse vanished from his throat. After Chloe walked out of the house for the final time, Julian stood alone in the hallway. His gaze dropped to the small velvet tray on the entry table, where she had left her diamond ring behind. His hand reached out, shaking violently. For a second, he picked it up, intending to sprint out the front door and chase after her car. He took 2 steps toward the exit, froze mid-stride, and stopped. He slowly lowered his arm, opened his palm, and placed the ring back down onto the wood table. He didn't run. He let her go. Julian didn't call me for 2 weeks after Chloe walked out of my kitchen. In those 14 long, quiet days, I stayed down in my basement shop, running my sewing machine, keeping my hands busy with silk linings and wool hems, and waiting to see if my son would choose to drown completely in his own pride, or finally learn how to swim in the deep end of reality. The change didn't start with a polished apology speech delivered on a doorstep. It started with cold steel and greasy knuckles in the unforgiving streets of Chicago, far away from the glittering cocktail parties and high-rise boardrooms he had spent years trying to impress. When Julian drove back to the city that afternoon, he didn't head to his high-rise contractor office or park in the reserved slot at the country club. Instead, he drove straight to a bustling downtown auto dealership, parking right in the middle of the pristine, sunlit showroom lot. A sharp-suited salesman walked out, flashing a bright, welcoming smile, automatically assuming Julian was back to upgrade his vehicle to the latest luxury model on the market. Julian stepped out of the driver's side, locked the door behind him with a heavy thud, and dropped the key fob right onto the center of the glass sales counter. "I'm here to sell it," Julian said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual boastful cadence. The salesman blinked, his professional smile faltering as he realized there was no lucrative trade-up waiting on the other end of the transaction. Julian walked out of that showroom empty-handed, except for a modest cashier's check, heading straight to a gritty used car lot down the road where he willingly traded his illusion of upper-class status for a beaten-up 10-year-old Ford pickup truck with rust blooming along the rear wheel wells and a scratched dashboard. That same evening, Julian emptied his master bedroom closet. He placed 3 luxury Swiss watches, 2 custom-fitted carbon fiber golf club sets, and an entire row of expensive designer suits into plain brown cardboard boxes. He drove across town to a reputable downtown pawn shop under the flickering neon lights of the commercial district. The clerk behind the counter eyed the gleaming timepiece, sliding it back and forth across the scratched glass display case with practiced cynicism. "Sure?" the clerk asked, raising an eyebrow at the brand-name luxury piece. Julian stared down at the watch for several long, agonizing seconds, watching the second hand tick away the remaining fragments of his fake lifestyle. Then, with a tight jaw and a heavy swallow, he slowly nodded, accepting the harsh reality. When the transactions finally cleared, he didn't use a single cent to treat himself or cushion his daily expenses. He took the cash straight to his local credit union and his credit card company, wiping out $45,000 of unsecured consumer debt in one clean, sweeping lump sum. Next, Julian drove out to the suburban branch of his primary mortgage lender. Instead of hiding behind fake profit projections, inflated business assets, or dodging collection notices, he sat across the polished mahogany desk from a senior loan officer. The officer pulled up Julian's historical credit profile on the monitor, glancing up with sudden, visible surprise at the dramatic, unprompted pivot in his financial standing. Julian didn't make excuses or try to shift the blame onto market fluctuations. He slid his actual tax returns, his terminated commercial contracts, and his true income statements across the wood surface, taking full ownership of his self-inflicted collapse. The bank evaluated his adjusted file and placed him on a strict 12-month trial payment plan tied strictly to his realistic earnings. With the debt mountain flattened and the mortgage terms restructured, Julian had to face the ultimate wreckage of his personal life. He drove to Chloe's apartment complex in downtown Chicago, parked the old Ford truck on the street, and walked up to the lobby. The conversation wasn't a shouting match or a desperate plea for reconciliation. Chloe listened with cold, unyielding detachment as Julian calmly recounted the full scope of the deception, handing over a certified copy of his debt-free credit report, a letter confirming his mortgage hardship modification, and a signed paper consenting to an immediate legal separation without a single contest. With his personal life stripped down to bare concrete, Julian had to rebuild his professional reputation from the ground up. He stopped bidding on multi-million-dollar commercial framing contracts that required teams he couldn't afford or sustain. Instead, he drove his old Ford truck out to quiet neighborhood residential streets, knocking on doors and pinning handmade flyers to local community boards. The transition was brutally humbling. For his first 3 job inquiries, the homeowners took one look at his unproven independent status, doubted his credentials, and politely turned him down, closing their front doors against the chilly autumn wind. But Julian didn't give up. On his 4th attempt, he knocked on the door of an elderly widow named Mrs. Gable, whose front wooden staircase and side fence had completely rotted through after years of weather damage. The project itself tested every ounce of his physical endurance and patience. On day 1, Julian miscalculated his lumber measurements in the biting wind, forcing him to drive back to the hardware store and pay out of pocket for extra timber. On day 2, an unexpected afternoon downpour turned the backyard into a muddy quagmire, requiring him to spend hours pitching heavy waterproof tarps over the raw frame just to keep the foundation dry. Finally, on day 3, the storm cleared, and he finished bolting down the last handrail by hand. When Mrs. Gable offered him a check for $1,200, the standard commercial rate quoted by major firms, Julian looked at the slip of paper, shook his head, and handed half of it back. "You only pay for what's real," Julian told her gently, pocketing only $600 to cover material and fair labor costs. Word of mouth travels fast in forgotten neighborhoods. Within 2 months, Julian's pickup truck was booked solid with urgent roofing repairs, window replacements, and fence building. His palms grew thick calluses, his fingernails permanently stained with sawdust, and his skin tanned deep from working under the open sky. For the first time in his entire life, he came home physically exhausted, smelling of fresh pine and sweat, but sleeping soundly through the night, without the suffocating terror of collection agencies pounding on his door. Then came a rainy Tuesday evening in late autumn. The wind howled against the glass panes of my basement shop in Canton, Ohio, rattling the frames as I stitched a hem on a heavy wool coat. Before walking over to the telephone, Julian had stood alone in his quiet living room, opening the old mahogany desk drawer. Inside, resting beneath a stack of unpaid utility bills from the past, was a framed photograph of his late father, David, holding a framing square with steady, grease-stained fingers. Looking down into his father's steady eyes gave him the grounding he needed. He picked up his mobile phone and dialed my number. My heart gave a small, cautious flutter against my ribs. I picked up the phone and pressed answer. "Mom?" Julian's voice came through the speaker, low, hesitant, and completely stripped of any past arrogance. "I'm here, Julian," I said quietly, keeping my thumb resting on the fabric of the coat. There was a long silence on the line, broken only by the heavy patter of rain hitting his truck window in Chicago. He cleared his throat. I'm not calling about money, Mom," Julian said, his voice tightening slightly with vulnerability. "Work has been steady. I'm keeping up with the modified mortgage. But I'm bidding on a structural framing job for a small community center downtown. It's an old building, and the load calculations are tricky. I realized I never really learned how Dad used to calculate timber stress loads manually when the weather shifted." He paused, taking a ragged, uneven breath. I remember Dad kept a small brown leather ledger down in his workshop, a handwritten notebook where he figured out material costs, waste margins, and structural weight ratios without a computer. If you still have it, and if you wouldn't mind, could I ask you to look for it? My fingers brushed against the edge of my sewing machine table, down in the bottom drawer of my oak cabinet, tucked underneath 40 years of discarded sewing patterns, sat my late husband David's worn leather notebook, its pages filled with neat pencil lines and geometric sketches of lumber layouts. "I know right where it is, Julian," I said, my voice softening as I stared at the drawer. "I'll mail it out to you first thing tomorrow morning." "Thank you, Mom," Julian whispered softly across the miles. The next morning, before the post office doors opened, I wrapped David's leather ledger carefully in brown craft paper. But before taping it shut, I opened my sewing drawer and reached into the small tin box where I kept my daily tools. I picked out a vintage card of steel needles, an old packet of hand-polished sewing needles with silver eyes, worn slightly at the corners from decades of faithful service. I slipped that small needle packet right inside the front cover of David's ledger. It wasn't money. It wasn't a bailout. It was a silent, powerful symbol of what my husband and I had always lived by, that true strength isn't bought with flashing lights or inherited wealth, but built one careful, patient stitch at a time, piercing through the hardest fabric with steady hands and an honest heart. 3 months after the phone call about the ledger, a handwritten letter arrived in my mailbox on a plain piece of white paper, postmarked from Chicago. There was no gold-embossed envelope or expensive cardstock from a high-end boutique. Inside was just Julian's careful handwriting in blue ink. Mom, this Sunday I'm making your Ohio-style chicken soup. Come up if you can. I've left a real seat open for you at the table. On Sunday morning, I caught the early Greyhound bus up to Chicago, watching the endless miles of highway and farmland roll by through the dusty window pane. When I stepped off at the station and took a local taxi straight to Julian's suburban house, the physical changes were visible even from the curb. The luxury SUV was completely gone, replaced by the battered Ford truck parked neatly in the driveway, its bed filled with heavy toolboxes, levelers, and coils of copper wire. I walked up the front steps and stood frozen on the porch for a brief second, my hand hovering in the air, feeling entirely uncertain whether I should knock or turn around. Before my knuckles could hit the wood, the front door chime rang softly from inside, and the lock clicked open immediately. It wasn't a butler or a hired wedding caterer greeting guests at the threshold. It was Chloe. She wore a simple knit sweater and blue jeans, her face bare of heavy makeup, and before I could even take a breath, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders, holding me close without an ounce of distance, hesitation, or pretense. "I'm so glad you're here, Margaret," Chloe whispered softly, pulling back with a warm, genuine smile that reached right into her eyes. Inside, the living room looked entirely different from the first time I saw it. The oversized, ultra-modern Italian leather sofa that cost more than my basement shop equipment had been sold off months ago. In its place stood a sturdy, simple wooden coffee table and a set of matching bookshelves that Julian had built himself with rough-cut pine boards. To my surprise, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, Chloe's parents, were sitting quietly by the dining table. The last time I saw them at the wedding hotel, they had looked at me with polite, distant curiosity, treating me like an inconvenient stranger from another world. Today, when Harold Sterling stood up and walked over to shake my hand, his grip was firm, and his eyes held a quiet, unmistakable respect. There was no trace of condescension left in the room. They had watched a young man tear down his own fake empire and rebuild his life from the ground up through honest sweat, and they respected him for it. Dinner wasn't served on silver platters or crystal plates. We sat around a wooden dining table, sharing a large ceramic pot of hot chicken soup, passing bowls and talking about small daily things. For the first 20 minutes, nobody mentioned the wedding or the past deception. Everyone just focused on eating in a heavy, quiet stillness that hung thickly over the room, until Julian finally stood up from his chair. After clearing his throat softly, Julian walked over to the sideboard, picked up a simple wooden picture frame, and placed it gently right in the center of the table. It was the framed wedding photograph from Chicago. But something had changed. Through careful, patient digital editing, work Julian had done himself pixel by pixel on his old laptop, the empty space beside the groom had been altered. Standing right there next to Julian and Chloe was me, wearing my dark velvet winter jacket, my hair neatly pinned back, looking calm and right where I belonged. The stranger who had been digitally pasted into my spot to impress high society guests was entirely gone, replaced by the truth. Nobody spoke a single word. We all sat in absolute silence, staring together at the photograph resting on the wood grain, letting the heavy buildup of the moment settle over us, before Julian finally broke the quiet. His voice shook slightly, thick with emotion, as he offered a condensed, heartfelt apology without turning it into a grand political speech or an endless monologue. I used to think being successful meant having applause from strangers, Julian said, his voice ringing clearly through the room. I traded the woman who worked every day of her life to keep me afloat just to buy a fake reputation. I am deeply sorry for locking you out, Mom. I was a coward, but because you finally let go of my hand, I learned how to stand on my own 2 feet. Nobody clutched tissues or cheered. We just sat there in the quiet truth of those words, letting the years of pretense finally wash away. I didn't give a grand speech or offer deep philosophical lectures. I stood up from my chair, walked around the table to where Julian was standing, and reached out. I gently straightened the collar of his cotton work shirt, smoothing down the fabric, and then placed my hand directly over his right palm, the thick, calloused hand stained with sawdust and hardened by heavy labor. I looked into his eyes and smiled. That was all that needed to be said between a mother and her son. As I rode the evening bus back home through the dark highway, watching the headlights sweep across the window glass, my mind was quiet and clear. I reached into my canvas bag, momentarily intending to unwrap a small keepsake box from the trip, before remembering that the truth had already been given and received. A gentle smile touched my lips as I looked out into the night, letting the journey end in absolute peace. Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.